чтобы вы нас слышали.
Отлично, хорошо. Спасибо. Это у меня просто помещение.
Добрый день, уважаемые участники встречи. Сегодня наша встреча проводится на базе Международного центра зеленых технологий и инвестиционных проектов с участием доктора Миллера. Основная цель нашей фонда науки, директор, управляющий проектами фонда науки, и я, который координирует научное направление. Основная цель нашей встречи состоит в том, что с приездом доктора Миллера мы бы хотели поделиться с ее опытом, так как она имеет очень большой профессиональный опыт по продвижению проектов на этапе акселерации, очень имеет большой опыт в проведении экспертизы проектов, посtakселерационный период, снижение их менторами. На сегодняшний день она с нами работает очень тесно с нашим проектом GCIP. Данная программа является НАО программой, где Международный центр зеленых технологий и инвестиционных проектов выступает главным координатором по проведению акселерации проектов. Недавно проводились уже второй год, проводится большой конкурс по принятию заявок. Рассматривается очень тщательно на всех этапах поданные заявки, проекты. Имеем на сегодняшний день своих победителей, которые также участвовали на международном уровне комплексно. Поэтому сегодня очень важно у нас на данной встрече присутствуют в основном ученые, представители научных организаций, которые, можно сказать, подточены, которые имеют очень большой опыт разработки национальных проектов на локальном уровне. Но было бы интересно сегодня послушать доктора Миллера, который может поделиться своим профессиональным опытом, какой-то инсайт информации, да, который могли бы учесть наши разработчики своей работы. Сейчас я хочу передать слово доктору Миллеру. Dr. Miller, that first for your expertise, we need to start like this. Numerous scientists and experts from scientific organization Kazakhstan, and they're very interested in your sharing, and they would like to hear from your side some maybe advice to prepare their projects for the professional level.
Thank you very much for coming in such numbers. This is short notice for you, but also short notice for me. And I understood that what you are interested in is maybe some lessons that are interesting to pick up from the work that I'm involved in, which is evaluation of donor projects, so coming with international funding. But in talking with my colleague here, I also understood that the reason for trying to capture some of the lessons is to understand what are these international organizations interested in, and how can you have a better chance to get projects accepted and actually being able to be valued. So I'll think about this as I'm going through some of the ideas. I just wanted to set in background, first of all, I should check to see if I'm going too quickly for the interpreter, because this is the first time that we work together. Maybe I should try to go a little slower. Okay, all right.
Правильно, если у вас хочет канал на русском, все нормально, или звук идет, или вот.
можете выбрать переводчика, и его начинает автоматически. Вы слышите, да? Речь доктора Миллера. Дайте, пожалуйста, обратную связь участникам.
Слышно, ясно.
So let me just start by giving you a bit of background about why I am here in Kazakhstan. Is to do a midterm evaluation of the GCIP program. My colleague introduced it to you. And in fact, I thought it would be interesting when you are thinking about your projects to also understand that there is a great interest to, over time, do an evaluation. Many projects now require, of course, an end evaluation, but more and more the practice is to have a midterm review like what I'm doing here in Ghana. And in this respect, it's, I think, important to know why do we do evaluation? So international donors they have, of course, in their mind, the notion of accountability, but more and more, we do this kind of evaluation work for what's called organizational learning. So in trying to pull out the learning from our experience, we try to do a systematic way to look at a project. We want to pull out the insights, but also it's important to understand if there are blind spots. Because we do the work every day that we do, we don't necessarily see what others come from the outside and are looking with new eyes, maybe can see these different perspectives. Another very important part of all project design these days is to have quite a large part of consultation with stakeholders. So in building your projects, it's really important to identify who are the key stakeholders and engage them. When I'm doing a review of a project, I'm also very interested in the breadth of the stakeholders, because there is an idea that every voice counts. When we talk to people, whether it's to design a project or to evaluate it, what we are interested in is actually the stories. We want to discover the stories behind the results. So coming from a scientific field, what I've noticed is, especially with the startups that we're working with in these projects as well, because clean tech is very much grounded in scientific foundation. There's a real strong interest to focus on the science, on the technology, but in fact, other stakeholders and particularly donors are also interested in what is the story about that. So we need to get better at being able to tell stories that can capture the attention, because we can remember stories, but also it engages people and it helps us to understand in a more holistic way what is working well and what may need to be improved. So this is kind of a new and quite modern way of looking at evaluation, but it's important to think about this in designing your projects and offering them to get funded. I make a big difference in the work that I do, trying to distinguish between what I would call the old way of doing evaluation, which was more like an audit, but what we are really trying to do now in this practice is to make sense. So making sense is different than counting beans. In English, we have an expression to be a bean counter, is interested in very small details and making sure that everything works. But in fact, in projects, it's more and more making sense of what is happening. So again, it also is very dependent on the context. In the evaluation work that I do, and this is important to realize when projects are being constructed, to know what are the criteria that by which it will be assessed for the performance. So these are standard criteria. They have been developed by the OECD. There's a reference on my slide, which of course I'm happy to share with you. But basically these big blocks of criteria, looking at the relevance, if a project is doing the right things. So think about this when you're designing your project. Do the components that you're putting together as a whole, all of the pieces, give a feeling that this project is doing the right things? And that can mean that it's filling in gaps that are needing to be filled. It's understanding the priorities that are there. It can also relate to coherence. How well does the intervention fit? That means within the landscape. So these days, we do not have greenfields. We are putting projects into a landscape, and it's important to know what else is going on in the landscape to understand how fit is your project, fit for purpose. So taking a bit more of a strategic view, a holistic view, to understand how a project will be perceived for being useful. Another criteria that we use in assessing projects, this is quite a traditional criteria, is looking at the effectiveness. So by that, it means looking at, to use the language of projects that I'm working with, they are set up with outputs and outcomes. And outputs are underpinned by a lot of activities or tasks. So when it comes to evaluation, people are looking at the outputs that should be then into generating the outcomes that you're hoping for. What are the results? And when we look at a project, we have an idea of how far you should be at a certain moment in your trajectory. Often donors think that you can get further faster than is the reality. Often projects are designed in a theoretical way without understanding how to operationalize. So when it comes to thinking about the effectiveness, I would say it's very important to, yes, be ambitious in your project design, but be realistic and even a bit more conservative, because you really want to have success as you move through the project cycle and be perceived that the project can be operationalized. And there are many, many projects that have wonderful designs that cannot be operationalized. I'll give you an example. Next week, I'm going to Ghana to evaluate a project, and it's got $7 million of funding to set up an ecosystem to facilitate circularity of plastics. So far, $700,000 has been transferred to the Ghanaian government, the Ministry of Environment, and they've only been able to spend $30,000. This is because the project is so complex, it's difficult to operationalize. And from that point of view, it's a real failure. The design is fantastic, but it's impossible for local actors to operationalize. So very important when you're designing projects and submitting them for funding to think about not only putting the pieces together, but can you translate those into work packages that can be put together and linked with other activities, with the interdependencies, but not so complex that you can't move. So this notion of operationalizing is quite important. Another criteria that we look at is efficiency. This is looking at how well are the inputs. So this is not only money, but also human resources and competences, capacities, motivation. How well are the inputs put into a process to generate the outputs? So efficiency, I mean, I think it's more important to be aware of what are the factors that affect efficiency than worrying too much about efficiency itself. So to be aware that the project is implemented within a context. and to be able to be realistic about those dimensions that will affect efficiency and effectiveness. What helps and what gets in the way. There are two more criteria that we look at, but these are typically not possible to evaluate within the implementation cycle of a project. And that refers to impact, trying to understand what is the difference. What we're looking for is difference in behavior, actually. Something must change because of the project that you are bringing into this landscape. And then, of course, a key part is, will these benefits, will these impacts, will these outcomes be able to be sustained? So the sustainability of the results of the project are also something that we look at in the midterm, but in fact, I think it has to be thought about right at the beginning of launching a project to already think about the exit strategy when you do not have funds anymore from the donor or the institution that gives the grant. So organizations like UNIDO, which is the UN, United Nations Industrial Development Organization, which is a partner with ICFIC on the GCIP project, they use these categories of evaluation, but they also add in more because, of course, we should look at how is the project being implemented. So the project management, the governance, the financial part, engagement and communication with stakeholders. But what is interesting, I've noticed in some UN organizations like UNEP, United Nations Environment Program, they actually ask the evaluators to not put too much emphasis on the project implementation side and to really concentrate on the performance and the design. And I think it misses the point that, in fact, the success of the project is not the design, but it's implementation. So definitely a lesson that I always try to bring forward. In United Nations projects, they have a big emphasis on what's called gender mainstreaming. So making sure that projects are accessible and provide benefits in an equal manner to men and women and youth and other marginalized parts of the community. So this is a dimension that if you mention it in your project, it's perceived to be very positive. So thinking about gender mainstreaming, obviously also thinking about how you would scale up and sustain, looking at the environmental impacts, the social side, those are also quite important. The GCIP project is funded by the Global Environment Facility, which is in Washington, and they add even more criteria that I should look at, and those are related to stakeholder engagement, the gender mainstreaming, as I just mentioned, but also knowledge management. And I think this is a very important aspect of projects that until very recently, there has not been enough attention. So knowledge management is important and you have to resource it. It's not just about saving agreements or contracts that have been signed. It's creating a whole system of how you document processes, how you put different activities together. What have you reflected on and learned as lessons? Using these kinds of processes and documentation to bring you
96 я буду только да.
Another aspect that international organizations look at more and more, they think about co-finance. And in speaking with your colleague just before the meeting started, I understand that the Science Fund also works with this notion of having partnership. And I heard about this in my meeting with Health Innovations that it's looked on more favorably, maybe even it's a requirement to have another partner. So the notion of co-finance in the international project context is referring to the contributions which can be cash or in kind, like facilities and staff time, that are put into a project when you're asking a donor or international organization to then also give a grant or some kind of cash. So there's quite some importance to also indicate that there would be co-finance. Co-finance is seen to be an indication of national ownership, and I think there's a good logic behind it, because if you offer co-finance in terms of facilities and staff, then you are directly engaged in project activity. So there's a notion you can learn by doing, by being partnered with other actors in the project, you'll have a higher chance to sustain the project as well. So there are good arguments for co-finance. And I'm just putting this kind of complicated diagram in front of you because this is another concept that is being used more and more, the theory of change. And these can be done in different ways, but normally it's in one page. You're trying to visualize how does a project intend to get the results that would be coming in the long term. So what's important is to understand that a project will lead tangible deliverables into other systems or other players, but also it should be
Я не хочу сказать, что все остальные
results.
есть много хороших певцов, но для меня он такой один. И в этом
Микрофоны, пожалуйста.
So in this theory of change, this is the one for the GCIP. What we are interested in is the assumptions. These are these external factors, and they are beyond the influence of the actors who are actually implementing the project or the partners, but there is an assumption that they are present in order to realize the objectives or the outcomes that you're hoping for from the project. So these kinds of assumptions can be that there is continued government support for building the ecosystem, or that there is participation from certain parts of industry. Even that in the case of GCIP, that we actually have promising clean tech startups of the volume and quality that we expect, and they should have sufficient access to the relevant customer segments. So that is an assumption that we are making, and we have to check it if it's realistic. In this theory of change, we also look at impact drivers, and these are seen to be under the influence of the project or its partners, and you can think about them as giving a boost to the effects that you can get. So these are related to, often related to project design, but they are related to the quality of the work, the different constellation of actors that you put together. How do you drive forward the results? And this is something to be looking at and checking and thinking about how can we bring even more impact drivers into realizing the results that we're looking for. In your project proposals, if you can develop and visualize a theory of change, I think it's very powerful because it gives a message to the funder that you have thought about the system in which your project will land in the landscape, and you've thought about how you will work specifically with some different actors, but also that you make explicit your assumptions so that if these outside conditions change, you can also get into a discussion about why your project has performed even better than you hoped, or in case some obstacles have come up, and then you can recalibrate. So on the basis of all of these, just one look at what I'm doing is actually a program evaluation. And this is something that is coming more and more with UN organizations to do activities in a number of different countries with global partners, with national partners, trying to see differences and similarities across countries so that you can compare and also do learning across countries. So my work this year is actually involved in 7 countries, looking at clean tech innovation, ecosystems, and the success of implanting this acceleration idea in 7 different countries. So Kazakhstan is definitely a really important example for me to understand. I've been to Moldova about 1 month ago. A colleague of mine is working on Nigeria, so we bring these ideas together to try to promote cross-country learning. Having any kind of project activity that has a regional aspect is often seen to be seen more favorably than something that is just in one's own country, because there is this opportunity for peer exchange and collaboration. Learning is also really favored if you have any opportunities to integrate that into the project proposal. So having thought about these things last night, so I did not have these ideas dreamed up in my head. I thought about them last night, about what can we understand from the way that international projects are being designed and implemented these days. So I have 10 ideas I wanted to share with you. And this is actually really quite important when you think about projects. The people who are looking at project design, when they design a project, they're really looking at the outputs. But when we are assessing projects, we are really strongly oriented towards the things that we measure, that we can see. So outputs and activities and deliverables. And what I find coming and doing an evaluation is that the project team actually loses the focus on the outcomes, because actually what you want to do is change something. And this is why it's actually important to be able to focus really on what you're trying to change, because you can change the outputs and activities and deliverables. It can create a lot of stress on the system if you need to do contracting of consultants. But I think more and more we need to move to adaptive management systems, because a lot of our project work is very emergent. You don't know what comes in the territory until we step onto it. So trying to balance having very strict projects designed and operationalized with the reality of what it means to be on the ground, I think is quite important. Another part that I have thought about is often I've been asked to evaluate projects of 3 years, sometimes even shorter. The GCIP project has a 5-year duration, but 3 years of funding. So there's an idea that within 5 years, they'll be able to use the 3 years of funding. So this is quite a new approach I've seen for the first time. But in any case, the timeline for implementing a project of just 3 years, it comes with an idea that you'll actually be able to make change, and it can be measured during implementation. And I would say it just doesn't work that way. You need a much longer timeline to be able to achieve change. So if it's even certainly with technology, you can bring technology or scientific invention into a landscape, but you need longer time for the adoption. So be careful about constructing projects with too short of timelines, because you need really the time to be able to see the change, to be able to get credibility, to have the proof of concept. And this is where this notion of proof of concept. Most of the projects that I'm involved in looking at, they are designed to serve as a proof of concept. And I think this is a good idea, but the resourcing of the project is too low, too limited, because you also need to have a budget, normally quite a large budget, to be able to communicate the successes of the project, what has been achieved, because you need to be able to bring the message into the larger community to mainstream the benefits of the project and scale it up and get adoption. So if you just do proof of concept, you will not get very far. You need to create projects that also have resourcing to be able to build awareness and especially build understanding of the results of the project and how you expect the intended population to change their behavior. Coming to this idea about in-kind contributions, the project in Ghana that I mentioned has $7 million in cash coming from the Global Environment Facility. And in the project design, it says that there will be $82 million of in-kind contribution. And I asked myself, where will this $82 million come from? It's not realistic, but in making these country level projects, especially with international donors, there's a really strong encouragement to make letters of commitment and letters saying that there will be these contributions of staff and facilities, and they have very, very high numbers. And I would say they don't actually reflect the reality of what can be provided. And it's better practice to think about what can be contributed in a realistic way, because from my point of view, the in-kind contributions combined with the cash that comes from a donor should give you the idea of what it will need to continue. So for me, this is related to sustaining a project. And if the number is 100 million, then you will, as a country, as a government, will not prioritize this kind of activity to continue because it's just too much resources. So I would say it's really quite important in making proposals to be realistic about what resources are needed and to go forward with that. And if you are able to bring more in-kind contributions during a project's implementation, great. Keep track of it and report it, but don't create expectations where you are setting yourself up to fail by falling short. Because once a number is there, like 82 million, the donor is looking at the end of the project to see, well, how much got contributed. And these numbers, they can't reach these numbers. Nobody can. Another key lesson to think about when you're designing projects is that there are a lot of other initiatives and projects going on already where there can be synergies. So make sure to exploit those synergies, to be aware of those synergies, aware of those other projects, and even the plans for the other projects coming up, so that you can really put a project into a landscape with important links and not in duplication. So this lesson is really coming directly out of my evaluation work on the GCIP projects. There has been a change in modality, the way of implementing projects now. This will come more and more that the funds coming from international organizations like the GCIP or the Global Climate Fund, which also provides a lot of funding that it might be interesting from the science side, technology side. It will come directly to the country, so to an organization like ACTIV. And I think it's important to accept project execution responsibility, but also insist on having enough resources dedicated to I would say, hand-holding, institutional strengthening, provision of experts that can come. So the traditional ways of implementing projects has changed, but without a transition. So I think these a period in which we work together with the international organizations or the UN is quite important, not just having projects where all of the responsibility is left onto the organization to cope with it. And this is another key insight that I've learned all along in all of my work in the international domain. People are called project managers, but they do not have the project management training or background. So you can have a technical expert, but that does not mean they know how to manage a project. People can be in a civil service or bureaucracy, but it does not mean knowing how to manage a project. And especially political appointees or delegates from international organizations, they're called project managers, but that is not managing a project. So I think it's really quite important to be able to build up competence for doing real project management and to know what that means. And a project manager, having a project in their hands, knows how to manage budget, scope, time. When things change, they can also negotiate, and they also have a very large capacity to get the results for people. So this is a quite important message for international organizations as well, because international organizations are often having staff there for political reasons, political criteria, which is very valid, but not having the project management expertise to go with it. I think this is now almost my last slide, but this is also quite important. So projects that come into a context like Kazakhstan, they've been designed without understanding that the context is actually very, very challenging. And the standard administrative processes that you've got, they don't actually facilitate and support a project-oriented context. So the GCIP has a lot of activities, has a lot of momentum. Things are needing to be organized that you cannot always foresee, and trying to plan all that 1 year in advance and being able to accommodate the needed agility. This is actually quite challenging. And I'm seeing this in all of the countries where the GCIP program is being implemented. All of the national bodies that have the responsibility for execution, they are all facing these challenges of having a project put into a context that is not set up for implementing projects. So if you're building projects to get approval, think about the context in which they would be implemented and the extent to which you can build in parts of the project to either consider that setup or think about what kind of actors you would want to bring it in that would be more appropriate, who would be able to work in a more agile manner. So the next couple of points are actually just basic management points, but I see these mistakes over and over again. So believing that just because something is written down on paper, that people will do it, and particularly in context of international development, where we see that the resourcing is just so low, and the resourcing provided for working in this context is not enough. When I was interacting with the other projects, like from Senegal, I remember a team said to me, I've been given a budget and I cannot hire any consultant who can do this work that would be competent. And I think that's really challenging. So again, it's all about being able to resource, to be able to bring the competence that you actually will need to operationalize the project. And then another point, again, basic management, believing that when someone says they will do something, that they actually have the competence to get it done. So again, this is looking at trying to get a good fit, but trying to really understand what projects are asking people to do, and to realize that we do not have all of the competences within one single person, within one single profile that are being asked. So such a broad view of competence is being asked now of a single position or profile, and people will do the things that they are best equipped to do, but asking people to do things that they are having less experience or less preference, maybe would be better done by others. It's quite setting a project up for fail. So just checking these things is quite important. Being able to get the right team. It's not one person who can do it, but creating a team where it has all of the competence, but also backup. So when one team member goes, you need to have contingency, added capacity to be able to take over, and not just put the load onto others, because moving people out is also something I see happening regularly in this kind of setting. And that's it. So 10 ideas to think about. I don't know if these were what was really the ideas that you thought might come. But what I just wanted to say about the GCIP project, I think it's really interesting because it's using a project to stimulate the development of an ecosystem. And this, for a country like Kazakhstan, which has already so much potential in the area of clean tech that has not yet been leveraged or known about, it's a great project for Kazakhstan. And to be able to spot these kinds of opportunities in the kind of projects that you're thinking about, again, if it's related to building up an ecosystem rather than just a project in and of itself for some scientific invention, it would be very, very powerful and gain a lot of attraction, I think, from different partners. So with that, I'll stop. I don't know if there are any comments or questions. I'm happy to try to react.
Уважаемые участники, у нашего спикера есть время 5 минут, встреча. Если у вас есть вопросы, вы можете сейчас задать. Большое огромное спасибо, доктор, что вы поделились очень интересными моментами, особенно организационной части проведения участия проекта, которые часто встречающиеся детали, где можно будет организовывать реализацию проекта, поэтому это одного очень полезно. Вопросы в чате вы можете озвучить сейчас, если нет, вы можете поднять руку, мы вам включим микрофон, вы можете задать вопрос.
Да,
Макпал там подняла, можете сказать? Макпалу мы.
Добрый день.
Добрый день, вас слышно. Представьтесь, пожалуйста.
Добрый день, меня зовут Махпал с Института топлива катализа и электрохимии имени Сокольского. У меня такой вопрос, это будут в будущем проекты объявляться или они уже есть, и как мы, где их можем найти, и как в них участвовать, требования? Вопрос понятен, да? Или перевести нужно на английский? Так, где мы можем, where we can find the requirements of these projects and the topics. Thank you very much for your presentation, for this webinar. Nice to meet you.
Вы именно про проект GCIP, да, спрашиваете?
Плохо слышно. Да?
Точно?
Вы спрашиваете именно касательно проекта GCIP, да, потому что GCIP вы заявку можете подать в Международный центр зеленых технологий проектов, у нас координатор является грант, или у вас
Ага.
да, можете нам подать ваши предложения, проекты, здесь специальная форма
Ну, мы
заявки.
можем более подробнее с вами сотрудничать, да? Я имею в
Да.
виду в будущем там,
Институт,
по требованиям. Как? По какой форме вот это вот все требования? Ну, в общем, мы сможем с вами сотрудничать. Да, это
Да.
правильно? Хорошо, спасибо.
Есть еще вопросы?
I've understood that your question is where can you find the requirements and topics for participation in projects? I think it's important to leverage your links with the UN organizations that are in the country. These days there is normally a country strategy, but there's an actor called the UN Resident Coordinator, and this actor is responsible for having an overview of all of the different projects that are going on in the country. And this person would be able to actually give a view of the different actors that are interested. So being able to get some kind of a discussion with the resident coordinator can also, through institutions like ICTEF, through my colleague beside me, this would be a really interesting conversation, I think, to have, to know what these different actors are proposing from all of the different development actors, and see if you can actually make a project that would fit what they're thinking about, because they are coming with their projects. Why not you propose projects to them? But I think this would be done through a dialogue, but knowing on the basis of what is being proposed, because there is a country strategy, there are international sources of funding that can be bilateral with governments, but also through these big funds, especially the climate funds. So the GCIP has big funding for climate, but also biodiversity, a huge new fund that has been launched, and then the GCF, the Global Climate Fund, which is based in Seoul in Korea. They also have a lot of interesting funding available under readiness proposals, and Kazakhstan, of course, is already working in this way. So I think these kinds of frameworks can offer a setting that is different than maybe what you're used to. And of course, there are terms of reference being offered all the time by other kinds of organizations, but from the scientific side, I don't know so much about it. So it's better to work with the structures that you know. But I don't think that's a really good answer. If I had more time to think about it, I would be able to come up with more, but at least the resident coordinator from the UN side is a source of perspective that maybe has not been tapped.
Если у вас есть вопросы, вы можете написать. Вопросов вы можете написать в Международный центр зеленых технологий и инвестиционных проектов, координатор является ветеран, и вы можете принять участие в реализации данной программы. Спасибо за ваше участие. Thank you very much for your presentation, for the information, for all that. Thank you.
Great to meet you all and have this opportunity, and I hope that there will be more and more projects for Kazakhstan.